Hi everyone, welcome to Insight. Today Tony's going to make us a whiskey sour.
So it's a really nice warm weather drink. We've been kind of trending toward that lately, and but it still has a good amount of body. What I really love about a proper whiskey sour is you use egg whites, which is a little bit scary to some people, but really it's only there for the texture, and it provides a really nice frothy, dense creaminess that kind of freshens the drink. So we're going to begin with shakers, and I think this is easiest in a 2-tin shaker rather than a Boston shaker with no ice. And we're going to begin with a ½ ounce per cocktail of lemon juice, freshly squeezed, and then a ½ ounce per cocktail of simple syrup, and then 1 egg white per cocktail. And lastly, the whiskey. We're going to use Rittenhouse rye. I think it's one of the better bang for the bucks out there for rye whiskey. 100 proof, so it's going to stand up nicely. And we're going to do 2 ounces per cocktail. And here's the not so fun part, the kind of fun part. We're going to dry shake this, which means we're doing it without ice. And this is where a lot of the body on the egg white froth is going to come from. And you're basically going to do this until your arm can't stand it anymore. So I'm actually going to enlist you for helping on this.
All right.
Okay, we're back after an extended commercial break, and we're going to pour that dry shaken concoction over ice. And then we're going to shake it again, but only for the usual 30 seconds this time. Then, your tins may be a little bit tough to separate. Just press right where they come together. And then we are going to double strain it, the regular strainer and a little sieve, into a coupe. And then we use bitters, just a few drops on the top, and that's to take off some of the smell of the egg white. It's not really there for flavor. So I'm going to do just a tiny combo, because I love combos of bitters, of smoke and salt, otherwise known as smalt. 2, 3, 4, 5. Also just a little bit of orange bitters, just to brighten it up a bit, since it's really nice and warm outside today.
Thank you. Cheers.
Yeah.
It is really nice and creamy.
Yeah. Very nice.
It's good.
All right. Cheers. So this week we have what I said in my blog is quite a doozy. This is maybe the piece I've most been looking forward to all season long, even though some of my favorites have been on this season. Mahler's Song of the Earth, Das Lied von der Erde, and we're very lucky to have 2 incredible singers joining us, Tammy Mumford, Richard Cox. It's a really interesting piece. Mahler definitely wrote a bunch of song cycles, some really phenomenal ones with Symphony, but this one is incredibly substantial. It's over an hour long, which makes you tilt more toward his symphonies than some of his other shorter song cycles. So how do you see this as fitting into his entire canon, which is pretty considerable?
Well, he wrote it in 1908, having just had a number of horrible shocks in his life. His daughter had died all of a sudden. He'd had to leave his position as music director of the Vienna Court Opera because of a series of anti-Semitic intrigues against him.
Yep.
And he'd also been diagnosed with a heart problem that couldn't be fixed. So he knew he was going to die, and he was beginning to process that. And Mahler had always been obsessed with death. I mean, we see it in Songs of a Wayfarer, we see it in the Second Symphony. It's always there in the background. But now he was faced with really dealing with it. So it's the first of a number of works that says goodbye. So it's before the Ninth Symphony, which of course is the ultimate saying goodbye piece. He could have numbered it the Ninth Symphony, Das Lied, but of course he was superstitious about Ninth Symphonies, and he felt that nobody would be allowed to write more than 9 because Beethoven had died after his 9th. So you got to kind of, that leaves the question open: is it a symphony or is it a song cycle? And it's really both. It's in 6 movements, and if we stay with the kind of symphonic idea of it being a symphony, we have a first movement which is called the Song of the Sorrow of the Earth, which is a tenor singing about how futile man's life is. You know, the earth regenerates itself every year, but man, you only have such a small number of seasons to live.
Right.
Then we have a second movement which acts like a slow movement in the symphony, which is called The Lonely One in Autumn. This is for mezzo-soprano, and this is somebody who's alone and the summer is fading. You know, that's not a feeling we get in Florida, but it's a time of year I always find very depressing. You know, the beginning of September when you're in the north and you feel the beginning of the winter winds coming. So that's got a very special atmosphere. Quite like some of the songs from Rückert Lieder in the way that it's orchestrated. It's a smaller chamber orchestra. Yep. And then we have 3 songs in a row. First of all, on Youth, then on Beauty, and then The Drunkard in Spring. And these 3 songs are much shorter and they act like a kind of scherzo in the symphony.
Very light in mood.
Yeah. We also hear the emphasis of Chinese music in these movements. The poems are all based on Chinese poems that Mahler found and translated himself. But the 2 movements on Beauty and on Youth use pentatonic scales quite often, so it sounds very, very Eastern, in a very kind of stereotypical European way, but in a very loving way. So each of those songs is a kind of paean to aspects of life that Mahler was having to give up. So he's no longer young, he has to give up that, he has to give up the idea of beauty. And those are very touching. One of them is a group of friends sitting on a beautiful porcelain deck that sits in the middle of a lake of tiger lilies and lotus petals. And the friends are sitting, eating and drinking, doing the kinds of things that people like to do when they're happy. And then On Beauty is a very wonderful song that describes a few girls sitting at the edge of a lake, playing, enjoying each other's company, when all of a sudden a group of handsome young men on horses comes flying by. And this gives Mahler the opportunity to do what he loves to do in every symphonic piece, which is to bring the whole world into the music. Yeah. So we hear the wild horses, we hear the kind of crash of the energy. And then at the end, once the boys have gone, one of the young girls, the prettiest of the young girls, sends him a tender glance, and we feel the real passion of love bubbling over. Then The Drunkard in Spring is somebody who just drinks all the time until he can't drink anymore and falls asleep. And when he awakes, a bird is singing, "Spring has arrived," and he says, "What do I care?
What's that to do with me?
What's got to do with me? I'm going to drink even more." And that's the end of it. Then the last movement is longer than all the other movements put together. Der Abschied, or the Farewell. And this is 2 poems that Mahler fused together. The first one talks about somebody who's sitting in the countryside at dusk, waiting for his friend, and he really wants to spend the evening, this beautiful evening, with his friend. And he describes how beautiful nature looks, but how much more he would be enjoying it if his friend arrived. And then there is a very strange passage of music that sounds like a funeral march. You know, Mahler loves funeral marches. Many of the symphonies, particularly the 5th, have these kind of very klezmery sounding funeral marches, and this is no exception. At the end of the funeral march, the friend for whom the protagonist has been waiting shows up, but not with good news. He's not going to enjoy the evening with his friend. Instead, he's going to say farewell and wander in the mountains. His life has not been a happy one. He wants to return to the mountains, to his homeland, to find everlasting peace. And this, of course, is a metaphor for where Mahler is in life. And then once he describes that, he contrasts what happens to man in terms of having to say goodbye to what happens to the earth. The earth renews itself every year. Every year it's green again, it's blue again. And the piece ends with the mezzo-soprano describing that process, saying it happens forever and ever, ewig, ewig. And Mahler writes this incredible music that floats and soars in a very subtle and understated way, and ends with this extraordinary chord, an added sixth chord that has a kind of eternal quality to it.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that's so special. I was reading today a letter that Benjamin Britten wrote to one of his friends. Britten was obsessed with this last movement. He played it all the time, and he writes in this letter, it's already midnight, so I've got to stop playing this piece. But he contrasts what Wagner and Mahler do when they're talking about love. When Wagner is talking about love, it's a morbid love and death has to follow. Think of how many times we have Liebestod, love and death in Wagner. But as Mahler writes about it, it's something that surpasses death. This love of beauty and of nature is so great that even though man has to say goodbye to the earth, somehow the love continues forever. And that kind of encapsulates what's so special about this piece, because there's a very bittersweet quality to it, but one is left uplifted and transfigured in that very German romantic way.
Right.
Not beaten down, but with this sadness, but this also this sense of the eternal that's actually very inspiring and uplifting.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting aspect to this. And aside, not that I'm anywhere on the level of genius of Benjamin Britten, but I would absolutely contend that Wagner's concept of death is purely metaphoric in the same way, just about releasing from certain constructs as opposed to being literal. But likewise, I actually, despite the imminence of death being pervasive throughout this, I absolutely, for the same reason, see it as optimistic, and because it's almost as though once one accepts the inevitability of this life cycle, the ability to then reflect on that which is most wonderful in life is very clear.
Yeah, you're right. And I think that Mahler did that in his life, because this is 1908. So he gets this horrible news. He begins to process that he's going to die, which he will a few years later. But he also says in a letter to Bruno Walter that his thirst for life, his enjoyment of life is greater than ever. And of course, he leaves Vienna, where all this horrible stuff had happened, and goes to New York and takes on the music directorships of the Metropolitan Opera and the New York Philharmonic, and lives the next few years absolutely at his fullest. Blazing, I mean, the busiest times of his life.
Yeah. Well, those are not, neither of those are small posts.
No,
so.
it's kind of unfathomable to think of doing both those jobs.
Yeah.
So I think it was cathartic for him in the same way.
Yeah. One last thing that I find really interesting is that while this is very Mahlerian symphonic music, there is something so operatic to some of the movements in the way that the music is absolutely intertwined with the text. And it's always fascinating to me that Mahler never wrote an opera, and who knows if that's sort of in the shadow of Wagner in the same way that so many mid-1800 composers were in the shadow of Beethoven, but so much of his writing encapsulates the same brilliance that Wagner's and Strauss's do.
Well, remember, he knew every opera backwards because he conducted them his whole life.
Yeah, right.
So, it is peculiar that he never wrote an opera, but I wonder if it was just a structure of his life. You know, he worked all the season and he wrote all summer. And I wonder if he had too much to say in terms of instrumental music to have time to write an opera.
Yeah.
But you're right. I mean, I'm thinking particularly of that moment when the young boys arrive on horses. It's very exciting and operatic in the way that the music depicts the text so vividly.
Well, very much looking forward to this. We're doing this not in the original instrumentation, which is not as large as some of Mahler's symphonies, but quite large. Too large for what we can contend with our physical distancing on stage. But we're doing it with a very intimate chamber orchestra, and it was arranged by the great Arnold Schoenberg, who was about a generation after Mahler.
It's really brilliant in the way he is able to conjure a huge orchestra with very few people.
But it also allows for an intimate side to the piece that I think is really beautiful and exciting. So hope to see you in Jacoby Symphony Hall Friday or Saturday night, 7:30. And we'll also be live streaming it on Friday night, either through our YouTube channel or the website. So, toi 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 this week.
Thank you.
Cheers.